Welcome back, guys, to the Storytelling Podcast, your cozy corner of captivating tales. I'm your host, Alejandra, and today we are diving into one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. This story has fascinated readers, myself included, filmmakers, historians, and lovers of true adventure for more than 50 years. It is a story of a man who claimed that no prison could ever hold him, a man whose determination to be free became stronger than the walls built to contain him. And with every word of his story it's either completely true or it has been transformed over time. Some memories were turned into legends. And this is something that we are going to explore today because the reality behind Papillon, it's almost as fascinating as the story itself. When most people hear about the name Papillon, they immediately think about the skepi. They think of dangerous oceans, the dense jungles, the brutal prison guards, the impossible odds, and the man who simply refused to surrender. Some remember the famous film starring Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman, a very young Dustin Hoffman, while others know the more recent adaptation. But long before Hollywood became interested, there was a memoir that shocked the world. Personally, I read it and it's one of my father's favorite stories. And if you're going to ask me between the original movie and the recent adaptation, no, well, no, no hate regarding the recent adaptation, but I do still like the 70s version. And millions of people read that memoir, and they could hardly believe that one human being could survive everything described within its pages. Personally, I recommend you to read it before seeing the movie, or if you saw the movie, just read the book because it's amazing. And today we are traveling back to France during the early 20th century into the dangerous streets of Paris, across the Atlantic Ocean, to one of the most feared prison systems ever created, and eventually to Devil Islands itself, a place whose name alone became synonym with suffering, isolation, and hopelessness. This is not your normal prison story. This is the story that is going to shock you. And it's a story of hope, especially because surviving in this condition without hope, I don't think that he could. And this story will force us to ask important questions. What if someone believes that they have been wrongfully imprisoned? And we spoke in the previous two episodes about the Birmingham Six. How far would they go to reclaim their freedom? How would you act? And if escaping means risking death every single day, would that still be better than remain behind bars? By the end of today's episode, you'll understand why the name Papillon, or Papillon as many say, I prefer to say this the French way, has become one of the greatest symbols of perseverance ever written about. And you'll also discover that the truth behind the legend, I think it's more complicated than most people realize. So let's jump to the adventure, shall we? And just remind you that this channel is made for you to binge. Many more episodes are waiting for you here on the channel. If you prefer a visual experience, you can also find the episodes on YouTube, where you can watch and listen at the same time. Now, before we even meet the man known as Papillon, we need to understand the world that created him. Because without knowing that background, it's almost impossible to appreciate how terrifying his journey really was. Our story begins in France at the start of the 20th century, in a country that, on the surface, appears confident and powerful. Paris was often described as the capital of art, fashion, and culture, still is. And you can see or imagine writers filling cafes, musicians perform in elegant theaters, wealthy families strolling along the grand boulevards, and visitors from all around the world admiring what many consider to be the most beautiful city on earth. It was an era filled with innovation, excitement, and rapid change. But like every great city, Paris had another face that tourists rarely see. Once the elegant restaurants closed for the evening and the respectable citizens returned home, another world would come alive. Hidden behind narrow alleyways and smoke filled bars existed this underground society made up of gamblers, smugglers, thieves, prostitutes, confident tricksters, and organized criminals who earned their living far away from the respectable image that France wished to present to the rest of the world. And money changed hands quickly, loyalties disappeared overnight, and violence was never very far away. The police fought constantly to control this criminal underworld, but it was this endless battle. Every arrest seemed to create another opportunity for someone else to take the vacant position. Informant lied if it was benefiting to them. Witnesses suddenly disappeared. Corruption was not uncommon, and justice was not always as straightforward as people hoped. It was into this complicated world that a young man named Henri Charrière found himself drifting. Henri was born on the 16th of November of 1906 in the small French town of Saint-Étienne de Le Jarret, located in the Ardèche region. Unlike the noisy streets of Paris that would later shape his life, his childhood actually began in peaceful surroundings where forests, hills, and quiet villages defined everyday existence. Everything was peaceful. People knew each other, life moved slowly, and the pace of countryside was very different from the excitement of the capital. Those who later knew Henri often describe him as energetic from a very young age. He was curious, adventurous, and never seemed entirely satisfied with a normal, ordinary life. Some children are perfectly happy following familiar routes or routines, but Henri appeared to possess the kind of restless personality that always searched for something beyond the horizon. It is difficult to know how much of these descriptions became exaggerated after he became famous, of course, but there is a little doubt that he developed an independent streak early in life. Tragedy also visited him while he was still young. The death of his mother deeply affected him, and many biographers believe that losing such an important figure during childhood changed the direction of his life forever. Grief affects every person differently. Some become quieter, while others become determined to escape the painful memories by constantly moving forward. Looking back at Henri's later life, it is easy to imagine that staying in one place was never something that it was natural to him. And as he grew older, France itself was changing. The country had survived the devastation of the First World War, but the scars remained visible everywhere. Entire generations had been shaped by the conflict, and families were rebuilding their lives. And young men searched for opportunities in cities where work, excitement, and fortune seemed possible. And Paris became this magnet for ambitious people from every corner of the country, including Henri. Like thousands before him, he arrived believing that the capital offered endless possibilities. In many ways, it did. Paris could transform an unknown individual into a successful businessman, an artist, a writer, or an entertainer. Unfortunately, it could also transform someone into a criminal. And the line separating honest work from illegal opportunity was sometimes surprisingly thin. Jobs were difficult to find, and money disappeared quickly. Doesn't it now? And the temptation to earn easy cash surrounded people every single day. Gambling houses promised quick fortunes. Smugglers offer generous payments for simple deliveries. Criminal gangs recruited young men willing to take risks, and once someone entered that world, living it's so much harder than entering it. Henri would later admit that he became familiar with people living on the wrong side of the law. He mixed with gamblers and visited questionable establishments and formed friendships with men who were certainly no strangers to crime. Whether Henri himself was deeply involved or simply associated with dangerous people, that has remained the subject of debate ever since, because much of what we know comes from his own memoir, and even historians disagree about how much should be accepted as a fact. One thing, however, and this is beyond dispute, is that by the end of the 1920s, Henri Charrière was no longer an anonymous young man searching for his place in France. His name had begun appearing in police files, and before long, one event would change the course of his life forever. But why we call Henri Papillon? Now, the word papillon means butterfly in French, and surprisingly, it has nothing to do with prison or escaping. Henri had earned that nickname years earlier because he wore a butterfly tattoo across his chest. In the Parisian underworld of the 1920s and 30s, it was very common for criminal, gamblers, sailors, and people living in the fringes of society to be known by nicknames rather than their real names. A very gangster way. And Henri's butterfly tattoo was exactly that. So it was his nickname because of that tattoo. And looking back now, the nickname almost feels symbolic because butterflies have long represented transformation, hope, and freedom. And they begin life trapped inside a cocoon before eventually breaking free and taking flight. And Henri could never have imagined that at the time he got the tattoo, years later, the image of a butterfly would become the symbol of a man who spent so much in his life trying to escape captivity. Now, the year was 1931. Paris was still recovering from the economic difficulties created by the Great Depression. Business struggled, unemployment remained high, and crime continued to occupy the attention of the authorities. It was during this tense period that a man named Roland Legrand, known within the criminal underworld by the nickname Roland Le Petit, was murdered. The killing immediately attracted police attention because it appeared to be connected to organized crime, of course, and detectives quickly began interviewing informants who claimed to know those that were involved. And like many criminal investigations of the era, evidence was far from perfect. Rumors traveled faster than facts, and accusations often depended upon witnesses whose own reputations were also questionable. Somehow, Henri Charrière found himself at the center of this investigation, and according to the prosecution, he had organized or participated in the murder. Henri denied everything from the very beginning. He insisted repeatedly that he had not killed Roland Le Petit and claimed that the authorities had built their case using unreliable testimony from professional criminals, hoping to reduce their own punishment. Whether Henri was truly innocent is one of those mysteries that will stay in the story, because historians continue to examine court documents and the witness statements and police records, and they try to determine whether the justice was served or if the wrong man was convicted. That I have my own notes about that. But at the time, however, none of that none of that mattered because the French courts reached their decision. Henri Charrière was found guilty, and the sentence they handed down would change his life forever. The words spoken inside the courtroom seem almost unreal. Henri would later write that in those first few moments after hearing the verdict, he could barely process what had happened. It was as if the voices around him has become so distant and blurred and meaningless. A meaningless echo, actually, he wrote. While one single thought repeated itself over and over inside his mind. He thought that he was not going home. He was not going to have another opportunity to prove his innocence. And instead, the French government had decided that he would disappear into one of the harshest prison systems ever created, a place which many men never returned. And for many people listening today, a prison sentence might immediately bring to mind like high walls, steel bars, watchtowers, or long corridors filled with locked cells. But France, had developed something very different. Nowadays, we have another one, of, like this one that I'm going to talk, but back then, it was way more terrifying. So let's imagine you have France, this superb country that I love. But do you think that they would keep dangerous prisoners in mainland France? No. The government spent decades sending thousands of convicts thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean to the jungles of South America. The official argument was that these men could contribute to the development of France's overseas territories through forced labor. They wanted everyone out of their sight. And it sounded practically, it was very practical when politicians explained it to, government offices. But the reality, guys, the reality was unimaginably cruel. French Guiana had become this dumping ground for people the authorities no longer wanted anywhere near French society. And the colony itself, it was breathtakingly beautiful if it was viewed by the eyes of a traveler. Dense tropical forests stretching endlessly towards the horizon, and towering palm trees that sway in the humid breeze, and brilliantly colored, birds flew above the rivers that reflected the deep green of the jungle, and the Atlantic Ocean sparkled under this fierce equatorial sun. To someone arriving on holiday, this looks like a paradise. But to a prisoner arriving in chains, it's the end of the world. The climate alone was enough to destroy many men because temperatures, regularly climbed above 30 degrees Celsius. We are talking about 100 years ago, while the humidity made every breath feel heavy. And clothing remained damp for days. Insects swarmed everywhere, and diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, or any tropical infections killed prisoners, regularly and frightening, and within days. Even those who survived the illnesses often became so physically weakened that hard labor slowly destroyed the little strength that they had left. And then there was the jungle itself. The forests surrounding the penal colonies were not simply difficult to cross. They were among the most unforgiving environments on Earth. They still are. Thick vegetation blocked the sunlight, making it almost impossible to navigate. You will lose yourself. And the poisonous snakes, they hid beneath fallen branches, on the ground, on top of you, where you walk. Don't touch anything. This is reality, by the way. And swarms of mosquitoes attacked anyone who entered. And when you think that, oh, that might be it, no, you have jaguars. You never seen them. They are present, and they will attack you. If you think that it's on the ground, think again, because they sleep on the trees. And the rivers, they are home to crocodiles and countless other dangers. Even experienced explorers struggle to survive there. And then we have the exhausted prisoners with little food, almost no equipment, and the guards hunting them. And, escaping from French Guiana is a death sentence. If you're not going to die inside, if you try to escape, you're going to die outside. And, the French authorities actually understood this perfectly. This was perfect. Nature, it's actually one of their best prison guards. And why spend enormous amounts of money building enormous walls when disease, jungle, and the ocean would do that work for free? It sounds cruel, right? But it's what they thought and still do. And this is a system that relied on hopelessness instead, if we combine it with punishment. So combine those two with the other thing, and then you have your real nightmare. But don't get me wrong, people that go to the French Guiana is not because they are going to sell cookies. So, you know, there was this another particularly cruel feature of the French penal system that shocked many people when they actually learned about it. Because that's another thing. When people, when you think about and you read on history books, many countries had an overseas prison like this in different parts of the world. There are many countries that did this, but normally the public, they didn't know much about it. They just knew, okay, he did bad, he's going to be far away, we're not going to see him, he might die in there, good for him, etc. But when people start to learn about it, that prisoner's sentence did not necessarily end when the years ordered by the judge that they had passed. If they tell you, or you're going to serve 20 years, no, my guy, you're going to serve your whole life because I'm going to forget about who you are. And many convicts were forced to remain in French Guiana for additional years after completing their punishment. Some were expected to stay permanently if their sentence had been long enough. But imagine surviving years of forced labor only to be told that you were still forbidden to return home because the government actually wanted former prisoners to settle permanently in that colony. And to countless men, it felt although freedom remained, permanently beyond reach because there was no colony. They even they would be free ever. And news about these prison colonies traveled through France, and their reputation became almost mythical till nowadays. Families whispered around about them with fear, and newspapers occasionally reported terrible conditions, only to be shushed after that. And while former prisoners who somehow, because we do have a couple of them that return, managed to return, they described the disease, the violence, and the endless suffering. And mothers warned their sons to stay away from crime by reminding them of the horrors waiting in the French Guiana. And the very name, still nowadays, it inspires dread. And Henri knew exactly where he was being sent. He had heard the stories. He knew that many prisoners never saw France again. He also knew something else. If he accepted his fate, then those stories would become his future. Years later, when people ask what kept him alive during the darkest moments of his imprisonment, Henri often returned to one simple idea. He refused to think of himself as someone serving a sentence. In his own mind, he considered himself a man who had been kidnapped by the state. And that difference might sound very crazy or almost insignificant, but psychologically, this changes everything. It's a mental state. A guilty man might eventually resign himself to prison. Okay, I'm guilty. I deserve this. But an innocent man, or at least a man who sincerely believed he was innocent, never stopped searching for the door. And before that search could begin, however, there was another ordeal waiting for him. It was the journey to the prison. Now, think about this. Today, when you're traveling from France to South America, it takes only a matter of hours by plane. Normally, depending on where you are from Europe or the western part of Europe to South America, especially to French Guiana, it might take you around 6, 7, 8 hours tops. But during the early 1930s, it requires weeks at sea, and prisoners were gathered together under heavy guard before being marched towards transport ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. The departure itself was, this spectacle, and some members of the public watched silently as long lines of handcuffed convicts shuffled towards the docks. Others shouted insults, convinced that every man deserved whatever punishment awaited him overseas. Remember, these people didn't know, but there's always a couple of them, right? And a few families stood in tears, knowing that this might be the last time they would ever see their husbands, sons, or brothers alive. It is difficult to imagine the emotions experienced by these prisoners during the final moments on French soil. Some probably regretted the crimes that had brought them there, while others insisted that at the very end they had been wrongly convicted, because there were many that were wrongly convicted. And many others simply stared at the harbor, trying to memorize every detail because they suspected they would never see their homeland again. And Henri later described the journey as the beginning of another life altogether. Once aboard, the prisoners quickly realized that comfort was not part of the voyage. They were packed into cramped quarters below deck where fresh air was limited, and privacy simply did not exist. The smell became unbearable within days. Sweat mixed with seawater, damp clothing, sickness, and human waste created conditions that tested even the most strongest stomachs. Every morning followed almost exactly the same routine. Guards shouted orders, chains rattled, the men lined up for meager meals that barely satisfied their hunger. Hours passed with little to do except think. Some prisoners would talk constantly about escape, discussing impossible plans, as though speaking them aloud somehow made them more achievable. Others sat quietly, staring at the wooden walls around them, already defeated before reaching the colony. And friendships formed surprisingly quickly because everyone understood that survival might eventually depend on, having allies. Henri observed everyone. That would become one of his most defining characteristics in his life. He watched who argue, he watched who shared the food, he watched who seemed trustworthy. He also watched the guards, learning their routines almost instinctively. Even before reaching French Guiana, his mind had already begun searching for weaknesses in the system. And one of the men who particularly caught his attention was Louis Degas. Degas was very different from Henri. He was older, calmer, and less impulsive, convicted for counterfeiting, and he had developed a reputation as someone who possessed financial resources hidden outside prison. Whether every rumor about his wealth was true hardly mattered, because prisoners believed he had money, and in places like this, belief alone could become dangerous. Henri recognized something valuable in Degas, not just about the money, but about his intelligence. And unlike many hardened criminals aboard that ship, Degas preferred thinking before acting. He understood people, he knew how to negotiate, and rarely allowed panic to influence his decisions. Henri, meanwhile, possessed courage, physical determination, and an almost unbelievably willingness to take risks. The two men could hardly have been more different. And perhaps that was exactly why they became friends. And their conversations began very cautiously. At first, they spoke about ordinary things, about France, about food, their former lives, and the endless ocean stretching around them. And then eventually the discussion turned towards the future, and that future contained only one subject worth talking about: escape. Most prisoners dreamed about it, but Henri planned for it. There is this important difference between dreaming and planning. Dreaming requires imagination. Planning requires observation, patience, and relentless attention to detail. Henri understood that escaping successfully would not depend upon bravery. He had that, for sure. But it would depend upon learning absolute everything about the place imprisoning him. And the voyage, of course, continued day after day, weeks after weeks, and sometimes the Atlantic remained very calm and appeared, super peaceful beneath that endless blue skies. But then other times, storms battered the ship so violently that prisoners struggled to remain standing below deck. Water seeped through every crack. Waves crashed against the hull with deafening force, and many men became violently seasick. The guards showed little sympathy. To them, these convicted criminals were not passengers deserving comfort. Eventually, after what have must felt like an eternity, for sure, someone spotted land. And the first glimpse of South America appeared faintly on the horizon, almost disappearing beneath that morning mist. And as the ship drew closer, prisoners gathered whatever they could to catch a better view, and some stared in silence, while others started praying. A few simply lowered their heads, unable to bear the reality that was unfolding before them. And Henri looked towards the unfamiliar coastline and tried to picture the years ahead. And he could not possibly know it back then, but this coastline would become both his prison and the setting for one of the greatest escape stories ever told. By the time Henri Charrière reached Devil Island, escaping was no longer an idea. It had become this purpose on his life. Every sunrise that illuminated that tiny island reminded him that another day has been stolen from him, and every evening he promised himself that he would not die there. Many prisoners eventually accepted their fate because hope is exhausting, and Henri did the opposite. The longer he remained imprisoned, the more determined he became to leave. Devil Island had earned this terrifying reputation for a reason. Although it's one of the three islands that form the Salvation Islands off the coast of French Guiana, it became the most infamous of them all because of its isolation and because it housed some of the prisoners that authorities considered the most dangerous or troublesome. Looking at it on a map, the distance between the mainland, it doesn't seem like impossible. It's only a few kilometers, but maps do not show the violence of the Atlantic currents. The water surrounding the island was notoriously unpredictable. Powerful currents swept around the rocks day and night, and this created the waves that could smash small boats into pieces before they traveled far away. And of course, we have sharks that inhabit the area, and even experienced sailors respected those dangerous waters. The French authorities believed that the sea itself was the greatest guard they had. Prisoners could dream about escape as much as they wanted, but sooner or later the ocean would claim them. But Henri spent months studying those waters. While other prisoners stared out to the sea with despair, Henri watched with somewhat curiosity. He noticed how branches floated past the islands. He watched coconuts, and saved this info, drift effortlessly on the current. He also paid attention to the direction of the waves during different tides and how the sea changed after storms. He started to understand the pattern that nature has, and if he could learn those patterns, perhaps he could use them instead of fighting against them. And little by little, an idea formed in his mind. He knew that coconuts floated because they contained air inside their hard shells. One coconut would never support the weight of a man, but dozens, packed tightly together, they might. And this sounds completely insane, right? But it was a very successful escape in history. And that begins with the idea of the coconuts and with the idea that this would be so impossible, but it actually happened. And according to Henri's memoir, he secretly began collecting coconuts wherever he could. It was dangerous work because guards were constantly watching him, and anything unusual, it would attract suspicion. He hid the coconuts carefully until he had enough to fill several strong canvas sacks. Once they were tied together, the sacks would create this crude floating raft. It was not a boat, of course, and it had no sail, it had no paddle, no way of steering. It would simply keep him afloat while the Atlantic current would carry him wherever nature decided. And then came the waiting. Henri knew that choosing the wrong day would mean certain death. If the sea was too rough, was too strong, the waves would smash him against the rocks, and if the current was flowing in the wrong direction, he might be carried out in the open Atlantic instead of towards the South American coastline. Every day he watched the ocean, patiently waiting for the moment he believed that would give him the greatest chance of survival. And finally, that moment arrived. Henri later described standing at the edge of Devil's Island, looking out across the sea, fully aware that he was about to risk everything. Behind him lay prison, punishment, and almost certainly the rest of his life in captivity. Ahead of him lay an ocean that could kill him within minutes. There was no guarantee of success, of course. There was no rescue waiting if things went wrong. There was only his hope. Without allowing himself to hesitate, Henri threw himself into the Atlantic, clinging tightly to the sack of coconuts. And the shock of the water almost took his breath away. Waves immediately tossed him up and down as though his weight was nothing at all. Salt water filled his mouth, burning his eyes, and made every breath difficult. Several times he feared he would lose grip of his floating sacks altogether, and had that happened, there would be little chance of survival. And for hours he drifted. He could not control his direction. He simply trusted that the current he had studied for so long, and the prison island slowly disappeared behind him until it became nothing more than a dark shape on the horizon. And at first, this gave him some relief. But then, actually, he felt fear. What if he misjudged the current? What if instead of carrying him towards freedom, it was carrying him farther to the Atlantic Ocean? And the sun? The sun was merciless. His skin burned, his muscle cramped. Every dark shadow beneath the surface made him wonder whether sharks were following him. And alone in the middle of the sea, there was nobody to help him. If exhaustion finally overcame him, he might be dead. But yet he kept believing. Hour after hour, the current continued carrying him away from the prison. And eventually, he noticed something was changing. The waves were getting calmer, and the outline of the South American mainland slowly appeared ahead of him. And against all odds, his plan had worked. When Henri finally reached the coast, however, his ordeal was far from over. This was not, it didn't end. Escaping Devil's Island was just the beginning. He was still an escapade convict in French Guiana, and if the authorities found him, they would send him straight back to prison. And he had almost no food, no money, no proper clothing, and he was physically exhausted after hours in the ocean. According to his memoir, local fishermen and indigenous communities helped him during part of his journey. Some offered him food, others gave him shelter for a night or two before he continued traveling. There were also people who risked helping him simply because they believed that nobody deserved the brutal conditions of the penal colonies. And Henri later wrote with great affection about many ordinary people whose kindness quite literally saved his life. His journey through northern South America lasted months and not days, as we tend to think. He traveled carefully from village to village, always avoiding the authorities, taking whatever work he could find, and relying upon strangers whenever luck smiled on his favor, which was not always. And every step carrying him farther away from prison system that had consumed so many years in his life. Throughout those years, one friendship remained especially important to him. And of course, you're going to ask, but what about his friend, Louis Degas? If you read or saw the movie, you know, Degas was this Henri's closest companion, this intelligent person with hidden money, and that balance with the reckless courage of Henri. And this was the character that we see. But in the books and the famous films, the two men almost seem inseparable, which, if you are in a high security prison, this doesn't, they are not on the same cell, they are not being seeing each other daily, because, if things were different or wrong, it would create suspicions. And in this kind of high security prisons, people normally go to solitaires or they are just apart because they don't want groups of convicts to become a group. It goes for riots. And historically, the reality, I think it's more complicated in my point of view. And many of the historians and the researchers that I did for this episode is that, and I do believe this theory, is that when the mind of people can generate other people when they need a support in a very hard time in life. It doesn't mean like this is all about mental health, of course. Doesn't mean that it's, schizophrenia. No, nothing like that. When you are dealing with a very stressful moment in your life, this can happen. You can generate something. And historians believe that Louis Degas was indeed the real prisoner, but the character presented in Papillon, the book, the memoir, was a combination of several different men that Henri met during his imprisonment. It was not just one person. While other believes that, the real Louis Degas never experienced many of the adventures described in the memoir, Henri always portrayed him as one of the few people that he genuinely trusted inside a world where trust was incredibly rare. But if he existed, their paths were separated. And as often happens inside the French penal system, prisoners were transferred between different camps and colonies, making lifelong friendships almost impossible to maintain, as I was saying. And Henri continued pursuing escape after escape, and the Degas story in the memoir actually faded. If you read the book, it fades at some point. You don't know what happens after the separation. And this is a mystery surrounding the memoir. Henri, meanwhile, continued moving west until he eventually crossed into Venezuela. And reaching Venezuela was perhaps the first moment in years that he allowed himself to believe that freedom might actually last. Unlike the constant fear that had followed him through the French Guiana, Venezuela offered him the opportunity to begin again. Life wasn't suddenly easy and he had this strange turn, and he had to learn how to live in that country, learn the language, and start to build a future from scratch, from almost nothing. He still carries that While he entered Venezuela, he still carries that physical and emotional scars of years spent inside of one of the world's harshest prison systems. But in the very first time, for a very long time, he could decide whether he wanted to go and when he woke up in the morning. That was the simple freedom that he wanted. Extraordinary as Henri Charriere's escape story is, perhaps the most interesting part of his life came after the world believed his adventure had finally ended. For many years, Henri lived quietly in Venezuela, a country that would eventually become his home. And unlike the frightening prisoner who had once looked across the oceans dreaming of his freedom, he was now a free man, trying to build an ordinary life. He worked in a variety of jobs, including owning and running restaurants, and those who met him later in life often describe him as charismatic, entertaining, and someone who could hold the attention of an entire room simply by telling stories. Whether he was speaking about prison, or the jungle, or the people who he had met along, Henri understood the power of storytelling, even before he put that pen to paper. But one question that people often ask is whether Henri ever had this peaceful family life that had seemed so impossible during his years as a prisoner. And the answer is a bit complicated, for what I found. Henri did not leave behind a large family or children who would carry on his name in the way many people imagine. Not at all. Instead, much of his later life revolved around his second wife. Yes, he had two. Rita Alcover, a Venezuelan woman who became his partner during the years when he was rebuilding his life. And by all accounts, she stood beside him as his fame exploded after the publication of Papillon. Imagine what that must have been. One day you are living a relatively quiet life in Venezuela, and the next, your husband's memoirs become this international bestseller translated into dozens of languages, discussed in newspapers across the world, and praised by millions of readers who could simply not put the book down. And the success was almost immediate. When Papillon was published in 1969, readers were captivated. They did not merely enjoy the book, they were obsessed with it. And people recommended to friends, I did it to you, and passed copies around families. I was given a copy. And debated endlessly whether everything Henri described could really have happened. Critics praised the incredible pacing of the story, which is so much more than this episode, while ordinary readers admire one thing above all: his refusal to surrender. But then Hollywood came calling. In 1973, Papillon was adapted into what many now consider a classic film, starring Steve McQueen as Henri Charrière and Dustin Hoffman as Louis Degas. The film introduced the story to an even wider audience and cemented Papillon's place in popular culture. Even people who had never read the memoir recognized the image of this determined prisoner staring across the sea, refusing to accept his fate, and already been decided. But as Henri fame grew, so did so many questions. Historians, journalists, and former inmates from the French penal colonies began examining the memoir more closely, and some noticed that certain adventures describing Papillon closely resemble stories that had been previously been told by other prisoners. Others questioned whether Henri had actually spent as much time on Devil Island as he claimed, or whether some of the most dramatic escapes had actually happened to different men entirely. Eventually, many historians reached the conclusion that might surprise you. They generally agree that Henri Charrière absolutely did serve the French penal colonies. That is true. They also agree that he escaped and eventually made a life of himself in Venezuela. Also true. However, they believe that Papillon is not a strict autobiography in the modern sense. Instead, it appears allegedly to combine Henri's own experiences with stories of several other prisoners he met during his French years in French Guiana. In other words, the book may be less of a story of one man and more the story of an entire generation of convicts who suffered inside one of the history's cruelest prison systems. And strangely enough, I don't think that makes the story any less powerful. Because even in some episodes, it belonged to another prisoner. The brutality of the penal colonies was very real. The disease was real, the forced labor is real, the isolation was real. The desperate escape attempts were real, of course. Many people had tried to escape, of course. Thousands of men endured those horrors, and many of them never lived long enough to tell anyone what they had experienced. But Henri did. And whether he spoke for himself or for many others, he ensured that the world would never completely forget Devil Islands or the French penal colonies. But I also want to add this note that for Henri, that he was so observant, he had to pick up, he didn't know the country, he didn't know the coastline. He had to watch, and of course, all the stories from the other convicts would, connect piece by piece. And in his mind, he would think, okay, he went through this, maybe I can do this. It works like this. You know what I mean? But I leave this to your own suggestion. And sadly, Henri Charrière did not have many years to enjoy his worldwide fame. On the 29th of July of 1973, only a few years after publishing his book that made him famous, and just months after the film adaptation was released, Henri died in Madrid, Spain. He was only 66 years old, and the official cause of death was cancer of the throat, a cruel illness that gradually took away the voice of a man whose stories had captivated millions. Almost as poetic, as cruel poetic as it is. A man who spent years fighting to be heard, insisting that the world listen to his version of events, eventually lost the very voice that made him famous. But his story didn't disappear. More than 50 years later, people are still reading Papillon. New generations continue discovering the memoir and watching the films, debating the historical accuracy of the events, and asking themselves the same question readers asked back in 1969. How much of this really happened? But maybe that's the wrong question, because I think that the better question would be, why had this story survived for so long? Why? And I think that the answer lies in something more deeper than prison walls or daring escapees. I think that every one of us at some point in life feels trapped by something. It might not be, of course, iron bars or prison island in the middle of the Atlantic, but fear can actually imprison us. And regret can imprison us as well. Grief can imprison us. Failure can imprison us. Henri Charriere's story reminds us that as long as someone continues searching for a way forward, hope remains alive. Whether Papillon was entirely fact, partially fiction, or somewhere in between, this is one of the greatest stories of perseverance ever written, because this reminds us that the human spirit has this extraordinary ability to endure suffering and to adapt to impossible circumstances, and continue believing that tomorrow might be the day that changes everything. And perhaps that is why, more than a half a century later, we are still talking about a man who had a butterfly tattoo, who refused to accept that anyone else had the right to decide how his story would end. And this was today's episode, guys. I hope you liked it, and comment below and share your thoughts. Have you read the books? Have you seen the Did you know the story? Have you seen the movies? And it's always nice to hear from you guys, and I promise that I have many more episodes ready for you here weekly at the Storytelling Podcast. And just to remind you that this channel is made for you to binge, and many more episodes are waiting for you. And if you prefer a visual experience, you can also find the episodes on YouTube where you can watch and listen at the same time. Thank you for listening, and please remember that if you'd like to send your stories or special topics to be shared in the next episodes, please send them to thestorytellingpodcast8080@gmail.com or follow me on social media at The Storytelling Podcast Official or Ale Life Official. But before you go, if you haven't done that already, I would love for you to click on the follow, a subscribe button, and see you on the next episode.